Sovereign debt is rarely discussed as a mechanism of control. We are taught to view a nation's deficit as a mathematical reality, a ledger of public borrowing governed by decentralized market forces. But mapping the flow of global debt reveals a deliberate, engineered architecture expanding across the globe. This raises a structural question. Without a unified one-world government, how exactly is macroeconomic policy coordinated, monitored, and enforced across hundreds of sovereign borders? If a country cannot pay its debts, the international financial system does not leave the resolution to the free market. Instead, the response is managed by three specific physical nodes. First, the policy enforcement arm in Washington, D.C., the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Second, the regulatory apex in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements. And third, the domestic central banks operating within the borders of the debtor nation itself. These institutions are presented to the public as neutral, stabilizing arbiters of international finance. Their actual structural design prioritizes the strict protection of foreign creditor capital while insulating monetary policy from democratic accountability. The blueprints for this architecture were finalized in July 1944. Delegates gathered at Bretton Woods to draft the rules of the post-war global economy. The delegates shared an immediate mathematical problem. They needed to engineer a system for international trade that would prevent a repetition of the severe economic contractions and currency wars of the 1930s. Two distinct frameworks were proposed. Britain's representative, John Maynard Keynes, argued for a politically neutral international currency, the Bancor, managed by an institution where no single nation held dominant authority. The American representative, Harry Dexter White, proposed an entirely different standard built around the US dollar. White's model won. The United States exited the war holding the vast majority of the world's physical gold reserves, allowing it to anchor the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. The dollar became the unavoidable center of global trade. To govern this new dollar-centric order, the delegates established two permanent management tools, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The governance structure of these institutions rejected democratic models. The United Nations General Assembly operates on a one-country, one-vote basis. The IMF and World Bank operate on a quota system. This chart visualizes how the quota system allocates influence. It operates identically to corporate equity. Member nations provide capital contributions to the institution, and their voting shares increase in exact proportion to the money they put in. Look closely at the threshold required for major policy decisions, an 85% supermajority. Because the United States holds roughly 17% of the total voting share, it possesses mathematical veto power over every significant change to the institution. This financial leverage is reinforced by a rigid, 80-year-old informal agreement. The United States strictly selects the president of the World Bank, and Europe selects the managing director of the IMF. From its inception, the architecture was engineered so that the world's largest creditors maintain absolute authority over the rules governing global capital. This creditor dominance becomes operational during a specific type of national economic breakdown, a balance of payments crisis. This ledger maps the mechanics of the crisis. A sovereign nation imports critical goods like fuel and medicine, and it services its international debt. Both require foreign currency, usually US dollars. When a country's export earnings fall, its foreign currency reserves deplete. It can no longer pay its international creditors. At this exact point of liquidity failure, the IMF intervenes. The institution offers short-term dollar loans to prevent immediate default, but these loans are exchanged for legally binding domestic policy changes. The IMF defines these policy mandates as structural adjustment programs, or conditionality. An analysis of these term sheets reveals a recurring mathematical formula. The debtor nation is required to execute strict austerity by cutting public spending. It must rapidly privatize state-owned utilities and infrastructure. Finally, it must devalue its domestic currency. The practical outputs of these inputs are documented across decades of interventions. In 2000, Argentina entered into a $40 billion bailout package with the IMF, accepting severe austerity mandates to stabilize its dollar-pegged economy. The required spending cuts triggered a severe domestic contraction. Unemployment climbed above 21%. Localized poverty rates spiked to nearly 60%. The domestic population absorbed the total cost of the structural adjustment. Simultaneously, the mandated currency devaluation and privatization requirements produced an advantageous environment for foreign capital, allowing international investors to purchase distressed public assets, like water and power utilities, at steep discounts. 10 years later, a similar mechanical process was applied in Europe. Following the 2008 financial crisis, Greece required a massive intervention from the Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. The mandated structural adjustment timeline in Greece corresponds directly with a 25% collapse in the nation's gross domestic product. Youth unemployment hit 60%, and the national health system suffered severe medical shortages. The majority of the bailout capital injected into Greece did not remain in the domestic economy. It was mathematically routed back out to service existing debt, directly protecting the balance sheets of French and German private banks. Structural adjustment programs function as efficient wealth transfer mechanisms. They resolve the immediate liquidity crisis by trading the debtor nation's long-term economic autonomy for the guaranteed protection of foreign creditor capital. The IMF oversees distressed sovereigns, but a third institution coordinates the central banks of the creditor nations themselves. It operates in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS functions strictly as the central bank for the world's central banks. When the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the People's Bank of China need to clear accounts, store gold, or align monetary policy, they use the BIS. This text is the Headquarters Agreement, a treaty between the BIS and the Swiss government. It grants the institution an extraordinary legal framework. Its physical premises are legally inviolable. Under this treaty, Swiss authorities have no jurisdiction over the bank. Its internal communications, physical archives, and the gold reserves it holds on behalf of member nations cannot be seized or audited by any external government, court, or citizen. The coordination of global capital happens inside this shielded environment, primarily through the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. The BIS and its committees possess no formal legislative authority. They cannot pass binding laws or write domestic banking regulations. Instead, they draft guidelines known as the Basel Accords, which dictate how much capital banks must hold and how they assess financial risk. Despite being non-binding, these guidelines are universally adopted into the domestic laws of virtually every major economy. This is achieved through systemic market coercion. If a sovereign nation refuses to adopt the Basel Accords into its own legal code, its domestic banks are deemed non-compliant and are effectively locked out of the international financial system. The cost of refusal is total economic isolation. This coercion is led by a board of directors made up of the world's most powerful central bankers. They determine their own membership and admit new central banks into their ranks at their own discretion. This structure creates a self-selecting oligarchy. By controlling its own membership and deliberations in private, the institution creates a closed loop of power that functions beyond the reach of any legal jurisdiction or democratic oversight. This forces a final structural question. Why do sovereign nations continue to subject themselves to IMF austerity and BIS regulations? Why accept these extreme concessions? The answer lies in the foundational layer that supports the entire architecture, the US dollar. Economists refer to the dollar's status as the global reserve currency as exorbitant privilege. Roughly 58% of all global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars. Critical global commodities, specifically oil, are priced and traded in dollars. To purchase energy, a country needs dollars. To service international debt, it needs dollars. Securing dollar liquidity is a matter of state survival. To process these dollar transactions, nations rely on a centralized digital highway, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT. This structural reliance gives the United States a potent geopolitical weapon. By controlling the nodes of the dollar system, Washington can enforce an economic blockade without firing a single shot. When a country is severed from the SWIFT network, it instantly loses the ability to clear dollar transactions. It cannot buy oil, receive export payments, or attract foreign investment. The restriction functions as a devastating economic blockade. The IMF's structural conditions and the BIS's banking regulations command absolute compliance because they operate atop this monopolized dollar system. For a sovereign state, exclusion from this base layer guarantees economic death. This model represents the complete architecture of global debt governance. A base layer of mandated dollar liquidity, an operational layer of IMF conditionality enforcing fiscal policy, and an isolated apex in Basel coordinating regulatory standards. Each node reinforces the other. The need for the dollar subjects states to the SWIFT network. A shortage of dollars subjects them to IMF restructuring. And the need to maintain banking access subjects them to BIS compliance. None of this requires a hidden conspiracy. The treaties, the voting shares, and the conditionality agreements are a matter of fully documented record. It is an engineered system. The architecture's specific rules, its voting structures based on capital rather than population, and its legal immunity from democratic oversight guarantee one consistent result. The system resolves crises by prioritizing the stability of capital providers over the autonomy of capital debtors. Widespread economic collapse and severe domestic austerity are the predictable, engineered outputs of a global financial machine executing its primary function exactly as designed.